So the next slides I'm going to share, I'm a little bit hesitant, but I think it might be helpful if you keep in mind the range of different ways to think about activating public opinion. So I'm just going to dive right into it so I don't spend too much time on it. But one thing to keep in mind is when people talk about public, there's a whole range, right? When you're down here and talking about people who do politics professionally, then they're no longer really public, right? But it could be any range from the general public to, people who decide, let's say they're going to spend a whole day talking about politics, to, people who get recruited, let's say to be a delegate at a convention and so on. And there's also a spectrum in terms of how inclusive you are on this end, how exclusive you are on that end. But the closer you are to this end, the more representative you are of everybody. The closer you are to this end, the more it actually requires work to get those people to actually be an activated public. So, this is almost like a sliding scale or a menu selection, if you will, thinking about how to activate publics. Another way to think about another kind of sliding scale is in terms of what kind of expression are people actually giving when they're giving an expression of public opinion. On one end, it's all you have to do to be a good citizen is just pay attention to the news. Right? You don't really have to do anything. And in fact, in a lot of political regimes, nobody wants you to do anything. Right? They may not even want you to pay attention to the news. As a public, that's kind of defined that way. And in terms of actually expressing your views, expressing public opinion, it's very cheap. Right? Nobody's going to arrest you for just not paying attention to the news, right? But that's in a spectrum all the way from actually getting involved in decision making, talking about politics. That requires a lot more effort. That's a lot more costly. It's often done in public areas where if you're in a particularly repressive country context, that may have a lot of negative consequences for you or your family members. The closer you are to here, the more anonymous the idea of public expression is. But the closer you are to there, the more informative it actually is. So if you think that governments really think it's prudent to heed public opinion, you'd like to know stuff that's more like here, because people are actually putting themselves on the line to be able to express themselves in those kinds of ways. And that's going to likely be more informative than people who simply, either don't pay attention or just pay attention. And then a third kind of way of kind of cutting at that is to sort of say, what kind of influence does it actually have on governments? Right? So sometimes it's almost a ritualized participation. We have elections, but it doesn't matter because there's only one candidate. But yet a lot of people show up, right? So that the influence of those kinds of elections on what government is going to do is going to be very minimal. And it'll likely just keep the status quo the way that it is. And elites, whoever are in government, are likely to say, that's great. Now we have public opinion. We're done, and we can just go on, with our clientelistic politics and so on. On the far end of the opposite spectrum is where there are actual bodies of people who are not elected representatives, who actually are able to do something that almost looks like negotiating with government, or actually sharing in control of what happens. Right? That usually leads to more radical change and requires more empowerment of people. And that's an important kind of sliding scale as well, and there's a lot more effort that goes into pushing in this direction. But the more you push in this direction, the more of a real influence activated public opinion really becomes for a lot of social problems. And then the last thing I think to keep in mind is that there are really varieties of public will, and it really a lot of times depends on how strong your civil society is. There are some kinds of civil society where even if people are really aggrieved by what's happening, they don't have much of a sense that they can really make a difference or that they should be talking about their grievances. And that kind of sense usually comes out of weak civil society. And then there are strong civil societies where there's a real expectation